The biggest breakthrough for me when I started working toward a clutter-free space wasn't about the stuff at all. It hit me that clutter wasn't something separate from me. It was a reflection of me, my habits, my mindset, and my life. Our environments are intrinsically linked to who we are as people. That's why I've spent years teaching a holistic approach to curating your space, because there really is no separating you from your environment. You can move somewhere else, but the problem is just going to come with you. The only way to make impactful, permanent changes to your space is through a holistic approach that addresses your relationship with your environment at the same time. Focusing on the clutter as if it's something other makes you feel disconnected from your space. It makes any efforts superficial. You get less impactful results and they don't last. Now, you can dig all into this in my free workshop that's linked below, but today I want to explore just one tiny area where the you part can get in the way of creating an impactful clutter-free home space. And it's related to how your brain distorts clutter. Back in the 60s, Aaron Beck developed cognitive theory to help people identify and change negative thought patterns and beliefs. A key part of this approach is recognizing cognitive distortions, which are irrational thought patterns that significantly impact our behavior and our decision making. In a nutshell, these distortions can skew our perception of reality, and they affect how we process experiences and make decisions. They're particularly relevant when it comes to clutter. So I'm going to spend the rest of our time together calling out some of these distortions and exploring what they might look like in your relationship with your home space. Let's start with dichotomous thinking, also known as all or nothing thinking. This is where everything feels like it has to be one extreme or another. I have to declutter all of my books, or I have to keep all of my books. I need to let go of everything that I own that doesn't serve a direct purpose, or I'm not letting go of anything because I don't want to lose the things that I love. I've seen this show up a lot when it comes to things like collections, books, movies, craft supplies, you name it. You start thinking, well, if I keep a few, I might as well keep it all. Or on the flip side, if I'm going to declutter, I should just get rid of every single thing. And the result is that either you hold on to way too much because you refuse to let go of anything, or you try to let go of everything and you feel overwhelmed and paralyzed by that. There's so much value in the gray space, the in-between, and being able to find balance. Keeping what truly brings you joy or serves a purpose without feeling like you have to make a sweeping decision either way. Now let's talk about overgeneralizing. And this one's sneaky because it's usually based on something that has a strand of truth in it. Some experience that convinces you that because something happened once, it'll always happen. You might find yourself saying, well, every time I get rid of something, I end up needing it a week later. It's like your brain grabs a hold of that one time you let go of something and needed it, which by the way was probably way more rare than it feels, and then turns it into a this is how it always goes type of narrative. And in this case, much of the stuff that you hold on to is out of fear rather than out of need. Overgeneralizing just takes a small sliver of truth and then blows it up like it's an undeniable fact. But the reality is that you've probably let go of plenty of things that you've totally forgotten about. Now, overgeneralizing can lead to catastrophizing, which is another thought distortion. And this is imagining the worst case scenario and then blowing things way out of proportion. When it comes to clutter, this might sound like, what if something happens and I desperately wish that I kept the extra set of dishes or the old clothes that I haven't worn in 5 years? It's like your brain is on overdrive thinking that letting go of that one thing is going to trigger a domino effect of regret and disaster. You might hold on to stuff purely out of fear of what could possibly happen, even if you've never needed it before. But realistically, those worst case scenarios rarely come true. And even if they did, most of the time you can find a solution that doesn't involve holding on to every little thing just in case. This brings us to minimization and maximization. With minimization, you downplay the importance of something that actually matters. And with maximization, you blow the negative possibilities way out of proportion. So this is actually deeply rooted in the psychology of decision making and the way that our brains are wired, which is something I talk about in this video, Why Your Brain Won't Let Go of Clutter. Basically, in the late 70s, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky created prospect theory to explain how we irrationally perceive gains and losses. In short, we consistently overweigh small probabilities. We perceive rare events as more likely than they actually are, and we underweigh large possibilities, perceiving common events as way less likely than they actually are. This is similar to like people who are terrified of flying but have no problem driving in a car, even though the statistics for car crashes far outweigh plane crashes. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that can go into that. You could be afraid of heights, there could be like other factors. But with minimization, you might underestimate the daily frustrations and inconvenience of clutter, thinking, it's not that bad, I can still function, right? You end up brushing off the fact that your clutter is affecting your mental clarity or stressing you out because it's easy to ignore the impacts when you're used to it. It's like saying, sure, my car is a little broken, but it's still running, right? Meanwhile, with maximization, you might fear losing something that you rarely even use, exaggerating the likelihood that you're going to need it someday, maximizing negative possibilities. And it creates this loop, this minimizing the mess while maximizing the fear of letting go. And that's when clutter really starts to take over because you're stuck thinking that it's both harmless and essential at the same time. Now let's talk about personalization, which can be a real trip up when it comes to decluttering things like gifts. This distortion is about placing an unreasonable amount of responsibility or blame for something on yourself or someone else. So let's say you inherited a collection of trinkets from your grandmother, and each piece comes with its own story, and now you feel this heavy weight of guilt about even considering letting it go. You might think, if I get rid of this, then it's like I'm disrespecting her memory. This sense of excessive responsibility can keep you stuck, wrapped up in guilt for wanting to create a space that feels right for you. You start believing that if you don't keep every little item, you're somehow failing in your role as a caretaker or honoring your loved ones. But just because something was a gift or even has sentimental value doesn't mean that it has to occupy physical space in your home. When you personalize with clutter, you lose sight of the bigger picture and you let those items dictate how you feel about yourself and about your space. Now, very often personalization will lead to another type of cognitive distortion called should statements. You've probably done this before, I think we all have, which involves placing rigid expectations on yourself or others. I should keep the fancy china set that my parents passed down to me, even if it's been gathering dust in the garage for years. With should statements, the pressure is usually coming from what you think others are thinking, whether it's real or perceived, rather than what you actually need or want. So they create this disconnect between who you really are and how you think you should be. You start shoulding all over yourself, right? So when you let should statements dictate your choices, you can easily end up keeping things that you don't even like. And it can lead to resentment and losing out on a home that really aligns with your personal values and lifestyle and your own personal story. Next, we have selective filtering. When we focus on certain aspects of a situation, while conveniently ignoring or downplaying others, then you get selective filtering. You might get really fixated on the idea of keeping that one vintage record player because it reminds you of the good old days, while completely overlooking the fact that it's been buried under boxes for like a decade. Or you might have the face cream that was super expensive and created by designers and totally overlook the fact that it's gunked over and that you wouldn't even use it if you wanted to. And if you really have your claws dug in on that selective filtering, even someone pointing out those facts can just gloss right over and not really click. And finally, let's talk about emotional reasoning. This is a big one. This is something that so many people get really trapped in. And it's this distortion that's all about making decisions based on how you feel rather than what is actually true. Now, you might say, well, our emotions are a version of the truth, but that's not always the case. Feelings and facts very often do not line up. So you might think, I feel guilty about getting rid of this old gift, so it must mean that I'm a bad person for not appreciating it. Or I feel anxious going through these things, it must mean that it's dangerous or bad and that I should be avoiding this. There's no substantial reasoning and there's no real logic to it, and it may flat out be untrue, whatever it is that you're feeling, right? But when you make decisions based on that, you can put yourself in a pretty bad place. Again, I get leaning into your intuition and trying to do what you feel is right, But relying solely on your emotions for decision making is a dangerous place to be. You can get trapped in your own mental jail of feelings, and you can become absolutely miserable because of it. So, I recommend trying to get into the habit when you feel something of finding and seeking out the logic or the data or the facts behind it. It's just a good practice to have, and it might help you to make more sound decisions about your stuff. All of this stuff that I talked about today is just one tiny little aspect of what it means to consider a holistic approach to managing your space. In fact, one part of a holistic framework that I teach for clutter free living is related to mindset and decluttering your mind. And this is just one tiny aspect of that. So, if you'd like to learn more, and I hope that you do, then I have a free training you can watch at miadanielle.com/workshop. I also have a starter kit that's linked down in the description that cuts through just some of the quick key points if you'd like shortcuts. My goal is always to help you to create a deeper relationship with your environment so that you can have an environment that supports you and reflects the life you want to live. I'll chat with you next time.